Marty Hadge.
Welcome to Boston. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be at the Congress. I've never been before. It's really awesome to also be able to speak to people. But I wanted to say that, as a person with a Middle Eastern background, as a trans person, as a U.S. citizen, as someone who was born in Boston, I think it's really important for me to tell you that there's a white supremacist movement, and they have a rally scheduled for Saturday in the Boston Common. And there's also a counter protest being lined up. And Natan.
There are flyers.
Okay, so there are flyers about it. And people might say, why are you bringing this up? But, if we can't figure out how to protect human rights, how to look at intersecting forms of oppression, if we don't learn how to stand together, we're going to continue to fall apart. And so I stand here, and I don't have a master's degree. I don't have a doctorate. I have a lot of stories, but I haven't written a book. I'm not that great looking, although I try sometimes a little bit. And, and I may look like a cisgendered white man, but I'm trans. And so I asked myself, why am I up here? What do I have to offer? And then I remember what the Hearing Voices movement taught me. They taught me I have my experience to offer. And that despite what I was told in the mental health system, my experience is real, is relevant, is important, and is meaningful. And my experience is one of that of having the experience of hearing voices and having visions and other unusual experiences that come under the Hearing Voices umbrella. And I've had those kinds of experiences since I was little, and I continue to have them now. And as a child, they kept me company, gave me faith and hope for something better. And they were just such a positive thing for me. I think they kept me alive. As a teenager, they became a lot more challenging. They were trying to get me to look at the environment I was in and the impact it was having on me, and trying to get me to address that. So they were challenging, but they weren't bad. And again, I think they really helped me stay on the planet, because they got me to stick up for myself. As an adult, young adult, I was like, I don't want to remember. I don't want to feel the feelings. I don't want to look at this stuff. And the voices were trying to get me to do that. And so I turned to drugs and alcohol, which worked for a while. And then it didn't work. And by the time I figured out it wasn't working, it really wasn't working. It had just become another way that my mind, body, and spirit was being abused. At a year clean and sober, people would say, Marty, aren't you proud you have a year clean and sober? And I would say, no, I'm a miserable person. I'm getting nightmares and memories that I don't want to have. But I couldn't live doing drugs anymore, and I couldn't figure out how to live not doing drugs, and I went into the mental health system. And there, they told me this thing that I kind of liked. The doctor said, hey, Marty, you're going to be all right. We just got to get you on the right cocktail. Oh, right cocktail. I've been working under that theory, too. Put the right drug in me, and life is worth living. So I continued to run from my experiences, from my voices, from my feelings, from my memories. The drugs muffled the voices. They didn't get rid of them. And all those feelings and experiences started to get really twisted in my head and kind of fermented. And the messages of my childhood became repeated in the mental health system. Having my clothes taken away, being held down, being put in seclusion. But now, instead of for hours, it was for days. I was told that there was something wrong with me. I was told that things didn't happen. I was told, just don't think about it. I was told, you're sick. You brought this upon yourself. I also figured out if I tell anybody, bad things will happen, that I'll get punished. They won't believe you anyways. They'll just say you're crazy. I was told I had a serious mental illness, that I had to take medication for the rest of my life. I was told I was too mentally ill to be able to get approval for a gender-affirming surgery. And so after years of seeking traditional mental health services, I became a zombie, shuffling around, twitching and shaking and falling down. I thought, if this is what life is about for me, I'm not so interested. And so again, I was thinking of suicide. And then I had a thought, and I remembered that peer support in the form of 12-step had really helped me stop using street drugs. I thought maybe there's something like that around this. And so on my little laptop, I type in peer support mental health. And that's when I found that the Holyoke space on the Western Mass RLC was within walking distance of my apartment, and there was one of the only few groups in the entire USA, Hearing Voices groups. And I went there, and people said hi to me. And I didn't say anything. I was on a Thorazine and Haldol, and people were happy to see me, and I couldn't figure out why I wasn't happy to see me. And I learned a lot. I learned that there are people who were told the same things as me, but they were creating lives they wanted to live. And I learned about the harm reduction guide to coming off medication. I learned that I had something to offer, which kind of makes me want to cry. I was given opportunities, and I would say, I don't know if I can do that. And Sarah Davidow would say, I don't know if you can either, but we're not going to know unless you try. And it was all right to try, and it was all right to have bumps, and it was not seen as a bad thing, but as a growing opportunity. And so, at the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community and in the Hearing Voices groups, instead of talking about being sick, we talked about strengths. Instead of talking about how to get rid of those voices, we talked about how to change our relationship to the voices. Instead of talking about our experiences in clinical or mental illness words like hallucination, delusions, and psychosis, we talked about visions, about hearing from deceased loved ones, about having spiritual experiences, about fears from the past interrupting the present, about times of having experiences so big that they were overwhelming. And most importantly, we explored the context of those experiences and discussed the possible meanings. So I could go there and say things like, I have a voice telling me to kill myself. And instead of being assessed and potentially locked up, people would say to me, that sounds hard. And Marty, have you ever heard anyone else talk to you that way before? And that feeling it creates, have you ever had that feeling before? And how are you making it through? What is it you're doing to survive? And just by being able to talk about it, just by having people be curious, there was some relief just in that. And I took time to think about those questions, and what I figured out over time was that that particular voice represented somebody who had treated me very poorly when I was a child. And once I figured that out, I was like, what else is new? They've been out to get me forever. Same old stuff, right? So over a 5-year period, I was able to get off prescribed drugs, became an HVN facilitator, and a national trainer. And I was also able to create enough distance from one mental health diagnosis in order to get another one. And since I don't have the PowerPoint, I can veer a little bit and say, I saw Paul Baker, and the last time I saw him was when he came out to do a training. And I said, Paul, when I met you, I wasn't even talking. And he said, yeah, Marty, maybe it was better then. And so anyways, again, a difference I had, a variation that I have, that experience became equated with a mental illness. I was given a diagnosis of gender identity dysphoria. I was in this strange place of having to pay out of pocket to raise money for treatment, but also of needing a mental health diagnosis in order to get the treatment. The Hearing Voices community, as well as the Western Mass Recovery Learning community, provided a great deal of acceptance and support for my transition. And now when I hit a difficult time, I have people to call. I'm getting much better at the airports. I have a lot of airport stories. I'm getting better. They're getting worse to me, but I'm getting better. And a few months ago, I had this experience where I woke up and I looked at my hands and they looked like my mother's hands. And if I didn't have HVN and I didn't have the RLC, I would have thought I'm turning into my mother. I would have wanted to kill myself. I texted Caroline. She texted me back, "Your hands do good things for people. You help people." And it reminded me of my goodness. You know, I wanted to cry. That's the nicest thing anybody ever said to me. And then I texted my spiritual advisor, and he said, "You know, Marty, it sounds like you're about to beat yourself up." And that was the message. I was very down on myself because felt like I had really blown the day before. So many things had not gone well, and it's such a relief to have people to help me figure these things out when they come up. And so I have this honor and pleasure of traveling across the country with Caroline, and she's one of the most inspiring people I know. And we get to meet so many different people, to hear voices, some of them in clinical roles, and some of them not. In our travel, we've learned that lots of people have spiritual experiences. Lots of people have had trauma, sexual assault in particular. Lots of people have been visited by deceased loved ones, and lots of people have struggled with being persecuted, sometimes from a punishing God, sometimes by demons, sometimes by governmental agencies, sometimes by recurring trauma in the mental health system and in the larger community. And we've seen how life-changing it can be to have a place where people can share their experiences without being labeled or dismissed. And so it's really important to not just switch from saying that these things are a medical illness to saying it's all about trauma. Perhaps some people have gifts and sensitivities that make them more susceptible to trauma, and perhaps some of us who go through trauma develop special gifts and sensitivities. We must remain open to many frameworks and to the importance of not having the answers for someone else, and value the place of coming from the place of curiosity. I must also say that it hurts my heart and my soul to have clinical words used in this movement. You know, these words have been used to discard me, to take away my rights, and to create a false pretense of understanding my experience. And I find it really, you know, if somebody wants to put that word on themselves, that's fine, that's a framework. But when you're putting it on people in general, I think it's really offensive and counterproductive to our movement. And so I pray that those with a persecuting God can find a loving higher power, one that has plans for them, not to harm them, but to prosper them and to give them hope in a future. I pray that we all find protection, strength, knowledge, and community to create lives that we feel are worth living, and that we continue to push back on social norms that would simply medicate us into physical, mental, and spiritual submission, and instead demand an exploration of the context of people's experiences. Last year, I met a man in a support group who asked me about my spiritual beliefs, and I kind of hummed and hummed. He said, "Marty, what's up with all those tattoos? You know, you got to tell me, what's the deal?" And I said, "Well, I have had some spiritual experiences." And he said, "Well, so have I. Tell me one of yours, I'll tell you one of mine." And I told him one, and he said to me, "Don't let anybody rob that from you by calling it a delusion." And now we go places to try to have spiritual experiences, which we do, and he says to me, "I'm not crazy," and he calls it a gift. And then sometimes he will say to me, "Was that a crazy thing, or was that a spiritual thing?" And I'll say, I don't know, they don't come with labels, but let's see if we can figure it out. So, without the mind-numbing drugs, and with HBN, and the RLC, and other peer support, I'm creating a life worth living. And I had a slide, which was a few sentences from my friend Music Max, and I don't know if I can remember it exactly, but he says, the few people who have this ability are regulated to be called mentally ill. And we're just born maybe a few generations too early, and that maybe at some point, love will sustain us all and people will come to understand what's going on. And my friend Max, they, I feel like they were helped to death. The medical model did not affirm their perspective, did not affirm their gender identity, and really blocked them from being able to create a life worth living. And that almost happened to me. But I found a Hearing Voices group, and I found the Western Mass RLC. So thanks. Keep up the good work.